We can see the Russia-Ukraine war this time. It can be said to be the largest war since the 21st century. Both sides have also fired a large number of artillery pieces in the artillery battles. Then I would like to ask the infrared expert, what is the general level of the artillery battles in the Russia-Ukraine war this time? What experience and lessons can it bring to us? Or, to put it another way, can our current artillery play a role in liberating a certain island in the southeast? Or is it like what everyone thinks, that rocket carpet bombing is enough? Well, the so-called traditional rocket carpet bombing. In fact, the role of rocket launchers themselves is not for precise shooting. Especially before the emergence of terminal-guided rocket launchers, what was the biggest role of rocket launchers? It was to clear enemy ground troops, including living forces, and the camouflage on the enemy's fortifications. Rocket launchers themselves are not the main strike force. They are a prelude to precision strike forces. However, with the emergence of precision ammunition such as GPS, satellite navigation, and laser terminal guidance, the role of rocket launchers has been greatly improved compared with the past. For example, the HIMARS and the terminal-guided and satellite-guided long-range rocket launchers equipped by the Chinese Army can effectively and accurately strike targets at a distance of dozens of kilometers, even hundreds of kilometers. But the Russia-Ukraine war is a very special war. The equipment systems of both sides are not sound. For instance, the Russian military is in the middle stage of reform, and the deployment of many of its weapons, including the update of its artillery equipment, is very slow. In this war, the Russian military has even taken out old artillery pieces from decades ago for reuse, including heavy self-propelled ones, such as the self-propelled platoon heavy mortars from the 1960s and 1970s of the former Soviet Union. They have also used a large number of towed artillery pieces. But what about the traditional modern artillery operations in the past? For example, the traditional formation where dozens or even hundreds of heavy barrel artillery pieces were lined up in a straight line, together with Katyusha, that is BM-21 or other similar weapons, delivering dozens or even hundreds of tons of firepower at a time. However, such a scene will be hard to see in future battles and wars. Why is that? Because in the foreseeable future, scenes of offensive confrontations between heavy mechanized groups will be rarely seen. In fact, such combat methods, war modes, or operational tactics are no longer needed for a decisive battle. It is no longer the case. Because, as I mentioned just now, the so-called weapon-based decisive victory and the downgrading of weapons have made the traditional combat mode of heavy mechanized groups in the past almost impossible for us to see again. It has been eliminated. Future wars will definitely involve systematic confrontations in the early stage, including aerospace system confrontations and information system confrontations. The Army, as an undertaker, or in terms of the Army's role, its greater function is to occupy and consolidate, rather than the traditional offensive or decisive role. It is not absolute, but its status has declined relatively by a large margin. So when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine is a typical example of an underdeveloped military. Before the war, without the support from the West, its artillery units were probably still at the level of the former Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. But Russia is only in the process of change. It has not yet reached the level of completing the modernization of its artillery. Therefore, the Russian military has fought very hard. It has been fighting for 2 years, and it has been extremely difficult, especially after Ukraine obtained weapons like HIMARS, Caesar, and even some unknown heavy terminal-guided artillery pieces. This situation has caused considerable damage to the Russian military. Even some of the Russian military's forward assembly areas, advance bases, as well as ammunition depots, artillery units, and command headquarters in the medium-depth areas have been hit by precision weapons. In fact, the core of modern artillery operations is neither the performance of the artillery nor the ammunition. What is the real soul of artillery operations? It is reconnaissance and target detection. For example, with the widespread use of a large number of drones, it is possible that Russia and Ukraine have deployed several 100,000 drones on the entire battlefield, not thousands or tens of thousands, but several 100,000. These include suicide drones and reconnaissance drones. They may have put hundreds of thousands of drones of different types and uses into use, which have achieved a very high level of battlefield detection and surveillance. However, it can be seen from the side that these two countries have very few means to counter drones or anti-drone measures. Therefore, at present, they cannot not only conduct effective attacks but also cannot provide effective protection for themselves or carry out effective suppression of enemy drones. So they are engaged in operations with some informatization features. However, through drones, some new intelligence means from NATO, and some reconnaissance forces developed and later deployed on the battlefield by Russia, they have realized a kind of traditional artillery operation under the modern informatization mode. They have a certain level of informatization, but they have not yet reached the level of truly and fully realizing the informatization revolution. There is still a gap. As for Russia, let's make a simple analysis based on some of the mechanisms of both sides. What kind of situation is the Russian military in? Because the Russian military is on the offensive side in its combat methods, it needs a very high intensity of artillery fire support. Therefore, the Russian military has deployed a large number of artillery pieces. It has even assigned some 122 heavy artillery pieces to the battalion level, and even to the sub-battalion level. This is a practice of the Russian military, from which we can also see that its demand for artillery and fire support is very large. Therefore, we can see in many photos and videos that Russia has taken out all kinds of artillery pieces for use, from those produced in the 1960s to many new types of artillery produced in the 21st century. It can be seen that their demand for artillery is very great. As for Ukraine, within 3 months after the outbreak of the traditional war, it basically consumed all the artillery pieces left by the former Soviet army. In the later stage, it relied on the support from the United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and other countries. These countries provided some self-propelled artillery or high-mobility artillery for Ukraine to launch fire counterattacks or support its own troops. This is roughly the situation. We can also see that in many cases, the traditional artillery in the traditional sense, after informatization transformation, still has strong combat capabilities, especially in terms of its fire response speed, strike efficiency, and the suppression and damage it can inflict on the enemy's strategic depth. It can still play a very significant deterrent role. Therefore, the Russian military basically no longer conducts large-scale personnel gatherings within the range of HIMARS. That is, within the forward range of HIMARS. In the past, the Russian military used to hold oath-taking ceremonies and mobilization meetings, but now we can hardly see such events anymore. Why? Because they have been hit many times by HIMARS, Panjihua, possibly a misnomer, maybe referring to a certain type of weapon, and even Caesar using such rapid response or precise ammunition. The Mojidao here may be a misnomer or mispronunciation, resulting in the death of some senior officers and the killing of a large number of living forces. Therefore, the Russian military is also keeping pace with the times and changing some of its traditional combat thinking in the past.